September 5, 1949, Cleveland, Ohio. The air was thick with the smell of high-octane fuel, and the roar of engines pushed far beyond their breaking point. 72,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes locked on the sky. They hadn't come to see a war. The war was over. They had come to see speed. Leading the pack in the famous Thompson Trophy race was a machine that looked like a P-51 Mustang, but it moved like something possessed. It was named Begain. It was a radical experiment. The radiator, usually sitting heavy in the belly of the plane, had been ripped out and moved to the wingtips. The fuselage was smoothed over, sealed shut, and polished until it looked less like a fighter and more like a silver bullet. It was piloted by Bill Odom, a man famous for flying around the world, a man who knew endurance but didn't know the violent, claustrophobic chaos of pylon racing. He was flying at over 400 miles per hour, just feet above the ground. On the second lap, the laws of physics demanded a payment. Odom cut inside pylon number 3. He pulled hard to correct for pylon 4. The Mustang, unstable from its heavy modifications, didn't just turn. It rolled, completely upside down. For a split second, the crowd saw the underbelly of the plane, a silver flash against the blue sky. Then, gravity took hold. The aircraft didn't crash on the runway. It plunged directly into a house on West Street, in the quiet neighborhood of Berea. The explosion was instant. Bill Odom was gone before the sound of the impact even reached the grandstands. Inside the house, a young mother, Jean Laird, and her 13-month-old son, Craig, were killed instantly. They had just moved in 4 days earlier. The house, their new beginning, was now a crater of burning aviation fuel and twisted aluminum. Back at the airfield, the race didn't stop immediately. Cook Cleland, flying a massive Super Corsair, tore across the finish line to take the trophy. But when he climbed out of his cockpit, the celebration died in his throat. The smoke rising from the neighborhood told the story. Cleland was blunt with the press. He told them Odom was a cross-country flyer, not a racer. He said the man had the wrong temperament for this kind of flying, but it was too late for analysis. That afternoon didn't just kill 3 people. It killed the golden age of air racing. The public had lost its stomach for seeing war machines turned into sport at the cost of innocent lives. The P-51 Mustang, the angel that had swept the Luftwaffe from the skies of Europe, was now being looked at with fear. It was being pushed into the shadows. But this tragedy wasn't the end. It was barely the prologue. The Mustang was about to embark on a journey so strange, so violent, and so enduring that no engineer at North American Aviation could have ever predicted it. The plane that was supposed to be obsolete was about to fight in Korea. It would serve under the flags of more than 30 nations. It would sever enemy telephone wires with its propeller blades in the Sinai Desert, and decades later it would still be fighting drug runners in the Caribbean while supersonic jets circled uselessly overhead. To understand how the Mustang survived, we have to go back to the moment the guns fell silent. August 1945. The world celebrated peace, but for the American war industry, peace was a catastrophe. The United States suddenly had a problem that sounds impossible today. They had too many airplanes. During the war, the factory in Inglewood, California, was pumping out Mustangs at a rate of 100 per week. It was a river of aluminum. But when the surrender documents were signed, the assembly lines froze. Thousands of brand new fighters were parked wing to wing in storage depots across 3 continents. They were perfect machines, 0 flight hours. Engines that had never even been broken in. But to the government, they weren't assets, they were liability. The cost of storing them, guarding them, and maintaining them was higher than the value of the metal they were made of. The solution was cold, industrial, and brutal. At Calero Field near Chino, California, a high school student named Ed Maloney watched the destruction. He was different from the other kids. While they were chasing baseballs, he was obsessing over flight. He stood by the fence and watched as cranes hoisted massive 18-foot steel plates high into the air. Below them sat lines of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators, the planes that had saved the world. The crane operator would release the cable. The steel plate would drop like a guillotine. It snapped the fuselages in half with a sound like a gunshot. It was a mechanical slaughter. Ed watched as crews took acetylene torches to the wings of P-51 Mustang, slicing through the spars, turning engineering marvels into manageable scrap. He saw mountains of technical manuals, the brainpower of a generation piled up as high as a house. Then someone struck a match. The bonfires of knowledge burned for days. One of the workers, seeing the look on the teenager's face, told Ed he could take whatever manuals he could carry. Maloney filled his car until the suspension sagged. He saved the blueprints, the flight logs, the soul of the machines. But he couldn't save the planes, not yet. For the vast majority of Americans, these aircraft were just junk. You could go to an auction in 1946 and buy a combat-ready P-51 Mustang for $1,500. To put that in perspective, that was less than the price of a new Ford sedan. The government had paid $51,000 to build each one, nearly $850,000 in today's money. Now they were selling them for pennies on the dollar. Foreign governments saw an opportunity. Under the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance signed in Rio de Janeiro, the United States practically gave the planes away to secure alliances. In some cases, Mustangs were transferred to Latin American countries for the nominal price of $1 each. The Swiss Air Force, needing to modernize, bought 130 Mustangs straight out of surplus depots in Germany. They paid about $4,000 apiece. The Swiss pilots, used to their pre-war Messerschmitts, couldn't believe their luck. They were getting the Cadillac of the skies for the price of a tractor. But inside the Pentagon, the top brass didn't care about the sale prices. They were looking at the future, and the future did not have a propeller. The jet age had arrived with a scream. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star had already flown in 1944. It was sleek, it smelled of kerosene, and it could outrun any piston-engine plane in level flight. The generals were intoxicated by speed. To them, the P-51 Mustang was a relic. It was a horse and buggy in a world of Ferraris. They believed that the next war would be fought in the stratosphere, at speeds that would peel the paint off a Mustang. So, the Air Force made a decision. They began to scrap the P-47 Thunderbolt. They retired the P-51s to the National Guard, treating them like weekend toys for reserve pilots. They were confident. They were arrogant. They had the atomic bomb, and they had jets. Who would dare challenge them? Then came June 25th, 1950. The radio reports from the Korean peninsula were panicked and confused. The North Korean People's Army had crossed the 38th parallel. They weren't just probing, they were flooding south. They had Soviet-built T-34 tanks, and they had overwhelming numbers. The South Korean military evaporated on contact. American commanders in Japan scrambled to respond. They launched their shiny new P-80 Shooting Stars. The jets roared off the runways, streaking across the water to save the day. But when they arrived over Korea, the reality of war smashed into the theory of technology. The P-80 was fast, yes, but it was a fuel hog. By the time a jet flew from Japan to the front lines in Korea, the pilot had burned through almost his entire tank. He would arrive over the battlefield, look down, and realize he had perhaps 15 minutes of loiter time before he had to turn back or risk flaming out into the ocean. 15 minutes is not enough time to find a camouflage tank in a dense forest. It's not enough time to support a platoon of Marines pinned down by machine gun fire. There was another problem. The airfields in Korea weren't the long, paved, manicured runways of America. They were dirt strips. They were short, rough, and full of rocks. When a jet engine sucks in air, it acts like a giant vacuum. If you run a jet on a dirt strip, it ingests stones and debris. The delicate turbine blades shatter. The engine explodes. The P-80 seconds were effectively useless at the forward bases where they were needed most. The Air Force panicked. They had bet everything on the future, and the future wasn't working. They needed a plane that could fly from a muddy field. They needed a plane that could circle over a target for hours, waiting for the enemy to move. They needed a plane that could carry 1,000 pounds of bombs, rockets, and napalm and deliver it with surgical precision. They realized, with a sinking feeling, that they had spent the last 5 years cutting that exact plane into scrap metal. The call went out. It was desperate. the Air Force began raiding the National Guard units. They went to the boneyards in the desert, pulling tarps off Mustangs that had been sitting in the sun for years. Mechanics worked triple shifts, flushing fluids, replacing rotted rubber hoses, praying the engines would turn over. They gathered 145 Mustangs. They loaded them onto the aircraft carrier USS Boxer in Alameda, California. The ship's captain was told to get to Japan yesterday. The USS Boxer toured across the Pacific Ocean, engines running at flank speed, arriving in Yokosuka in just 8 days and 7 hours, a record that still stands. The pilots were a mix of old hands and terrified kids. The designation of the plane had changed. The P for pursuit was replaced by F for fighter. It was now the F-51. But a name change didn't fix the danger. Lieutenant Jahar, a young pilot with barely 200 hours in the Mustang, found himself thrown into the chaos. He wasn't flying high-altitude escorts like the heroes of World War II. He was flying close air support. On July 10, 1950, Ha was heading toward a town called Chonan. His radio died. Silence in the cockpit. He looked down and saw the dust trails of 2 North Korean tanks moving on a road. He couldn't call his wingman. He couldn't ask for permission. He had to make a choice. He rolled the Mustang over and dove. The ground rushed up at him, trees, rocks, the terrifying reality of the terrain. He lined up the tank in his sights and squeezed the trigger. 6.50 caliber machine guns roared to life, shaking the airframe. The tank erupted. He didn't pull up. He followed the road, finding a convoy of trucks. He strafed them until his ammunition counters read 0. When he finally landed at a primitive airstrip, he was shaking. He had to hitchhike for 5 days just to get back to his unit. This was the new war. The romantic dogfights were gone. This was dirty, low-level slugging. And the Mustang, for all its power, had a fatal flaw. A flaw that the pilots in Korea were about to discover in the most horrific way possible. The Mustang was a masterpiece of aerodynamics, but in the brutal, mud-slogging War of Korea, its greatest strength became its deadliest weakness. The heart of the P-51 was the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. It was liquid-cooled. To keep that massive V12 running, it needed a constant flow of coolant, pumped through a radiator located on the underside of the fuselage. In the thin air at 25,000 feet over Berlin, this design was genius. It reduced drag and kept the engine happy. But at 500 feet over a Korean rice paddy, it was a suicide note. The air in Korea was thick with lead. North Korean soldiers didn't need anti-aircraft missiles. They just needed rifles. They would lie on their backs in the ditches and fire wildly into the sky as the Mustangs roared over. All it took was a single bullet, a tiny piece of metal no bigger than your finger. If that bullet punctured the radiator or a coolant line, the clock started ticking. The pilot would see the temperature gauge spike. White steam would trail from the aircraft. Within minutes, the engine would seize, turning into a solid block of fused metal. Silence would slam into the cockpit. There was no gliding back to base. The Mustang, heavy with bombs and fuel, had the glide ratio of a brick. The pilot had seconds to bail out into enemy territory or ride the machine down into a fiery crash. Ed Schmude, the brilliant engineer who had designed the Mustang, watched the reports coming in from Korea with a sick feeling in his stomach. He told anyone who would listen, the P-51 is a high-altitude fighter. It was never meant for this. The tragedy was that the Air Force had the perfect plane for this war. The P-47 Thunderbolt. It was an ugly, heavy bruiser with an air-cooled radial engine. You could shoot a cylinder head clean off a Thunderbolt, and it would cough, spit oil, and fly you home. It was a flying tank. But the Air Force, in their obsession with jets, had scrapped them. They had melted down the tanks and sent the racehorses to do the heavy lifting. The numbers were horrifying. 335 Mustangs were lost in Korea. 264 pilots were killed or went missing. But here is the statistic that keeps historians awake at night. Only 10 of those Mustangs were shot down by enemy aircraft. The rest, over 300 of them, were brought down by ground fire, accidents, or the brutal environment. And the environment was an enemy all its own. Winter in Korea was a freezing hell. The winds howled down from Siberia, turning the airfields into sheets of ice. The Mustangs had no de-icing boots on their wings. If a pilot flew through a cloud at low altitude, ice would flash freeze onto the wings in seconds, destroying the lift. An overloaded Mustang that stalls at 300 feet doesn't recover. It simply falls on the ground. The conditions were medieval. Mechanics worked with bare hands on frozen metal, their skin tearing on the bolts. There were no heated hangars. Desperate to stay alive, the crews rigged up homemade stoves using empty oil drums and 100-octane aviation fuel. It was a recipe for disaster. Tents exploded. Men who had survived combat missions burned to death in their sleep because a heater malfunctioned. Yet, despite the cold, the vulnerability, and the exhaustion, the Mustang pilots kept flying. They had to. The jet still couldn't do the job. The North Koreans learned to fear the specific sound of the Merlin engine, but what they feared most was what hung under the wings: napalm. The pilots of the 51st Fighter Interceptor Squadron weren't satisfied with standard military-issue napalm. They became chemists of destruction. They mixed the jellied gasoline with thermite, creating a substance that burned so hot it could melt the rubber tires off a tank from 50 yards away. When a Mustang dropped its canisters, the jungle didn't just burn, it vanished. The psychological impact was devastating. North Korean convoys stopped moving during the day. Commanders ordered their troops to drive tanks into barns, into haystacks, even into peasant houses, just to hide the metal from the eyes circling above. The Americans weren't alone in this meat grinder. The call went out to the United Nations, and the old alliances of World War II flickered back to life. The Australians arrived with their number 77 Squadron. They flew Mustangs until April 1951. They hammered the enemy around the Pusan perimeter, buying time for the retreating UN forces. Then came the South Africans, the flying cheetahs of number 2 Squadron. They flew with a reckless bravery that earned them the respect of every American on the line. But they paid for it. 12 South African pilots killed, 30 missing. They flew until the wings practically fell off their planes. And then there were the South Koreans themselves. For them, this wasn't a police action. It was a fight for extinction. The Republic of Korea Air Force didn't have money for jets. They took the hand-me-down Mustangs the Americans gave them. Some of these Korean pilots were veterans who had flown Zeros for the Japanese Imperial Navy just 5 years earlier. They knew how to kill. They knew how to die. They flew the Mustang with a desperate fury, knowing that if they failed, their country would cease to exist. By 1953, the jets had finally caught up. Better runways were built. The F-86 Sabre took over the air-to-air fight, and the F-84 Thunderjet took over the bombing. The Mustang was tired. It was worn out. The last American F-51s were handed over to the South Koreans in January. The era of the propeller fighter in the U.S. Air Force ended not with a bang, but with a quiet retirement. On January 27, 1957, the last Mustang in American service, hidden away in a West Virginia National Guard unit, was flown to a museum. It was over. The United States was done with the past. But on the other side of the world, in the scorching heat of the Middle East, the Mustang was just waking up. Israel, 1948, a nation born in fire. The British mandate had ended in May. The State of Israel declared independence, and within hours, 5 Arab armies invaded: Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. They came with tanks. They came with Spitfires and Hurricanes left behind by the British. Israel had nothing. Their air force consisted of a few fabric-covered Piper Cubs and some smugglers' planes. They were desperate. Israeli agents scoured the globe, looking for anything with guns and an engine. In the United States, they found 4 P-51 Mustangs for sale. There was just one massive problem: an arms embargo. President Harry Truman had strictly forbidden the sale of military aircraft to the Middle East. It was a federal crime to ship a fighter plane to Israel. The FBI was watching the ports. The State Department was watching the money. So, the Israelis got creative. They didn't buy airplanes. They bought agricultural equipment. Al Schwimmer, a flight engineer with nerves of steel, organized the operation. They took the Mustangs apart. They created the fuselages, the wings, and the props into massive wooden boxes. On the shipping manifest, They labeled them as combine harvesters manufactured by a fake company. Nobody at the docks questioned why a combine harvester weighed 3 tons and required high-octane fuel. The crates slipped through the net. They arrived in Israel in September 1948. There were no hangars. There were no manuals. Mechanics dragged the crates into the orange groves near Herzliya hiding them under the trees to avoid Egyptian reconnaissance planes. They assembled the fighters in the dirt, working by flashlight, figuring out the wiring as they went. Within days, the Mustangs were in the air. The balance of power shifted overnight. The Arab Air Forces were flying short-range British fighters. The Mustang had the legs to fly from Tel Aviv to Damascus, circle the city and fly back. It could reach Cairo. It was a strategic weapon in a tactical war. On November 20th, 1948, a British Royal Air Force Mosquito was flying high over Israel on a reconnaissance mission. The British, officially neutral but politically hostile, had been flying these spy flights with impunity. They flew high and fast, confident that the Israelis had nothing that could touch them. They were wrong. An American volunteer named Wayne Peake sat in the cockpit of one of those smuggled Mustangs. He got the scramble order. He pushed the throttle forward, the Merlin engine screaming as he clawed for altitude. He caught the Mosquito. He didn't fire a warning shot. He shot it down. The wreckage fell into the Mediterranean. The message was clear. The skies over Israel belonged to Israel, but the Mustang's strangest mission was yet to come. It would involve a daring raid, a pair of wire cutters, and a flight profile so low that the pilots would taste the sand in their teeth. The war in the Middle East didn't stop. It just changed shape. By the mid-1950s, the jet age had firmly taken hold. The skies were filling with swept-wing fighters. Israel was buying French Mystères and British Meteors. The Mustang should have been retired. It should have been a museum piece. But in October 1956, during the Suez crisis, the P-51 was called upon to do something no aircraft designer had ever hallucinated. The plan was a secret pact between Israel, Britain, and France. They were going to attack Egypt. For Israel, the goal was to strike fast and hard across the Sinai Desert, but there was a problem. The Egyptian army was massive. If their commanders in Cairo could talk to their tank divisions on the front lines, the Israeli advance would be crushed. Israeli intelligence knew that the Egyptians didn't trust radios. They relied on old-fashioned, physical telephone lines strung on wooden poles across the endless sand. If those lines were cut, the Egyptian army would be deaf, dumb, and blind. But how do you cut a telephone wire in the middle of a hostile desert without sending in a commando team on a suicide mission? You use a Mustang. On October 29th, at 3 p.m., 4 P-51 Mustangs roared off a runway in Israel. They weren't carrying bombs. They were carrying a strange, improvised device attached to their tails, a heavy weight on a long cable designed to snag the wires and snap them. The pilots dropped down, lower, lower, until the shadows of their planes were racing directly beneath them. They were flying at treetop level, but there were no trees, just sand and telephone poles. The mission went wrong almost immediately. As they approached the target area, the cable mechanisms failed. The weight snapped off. The pilots looked at each other. They had orders. The lines had to be cut. They didn't turn back. They didn't abort. They made a decision that borders on insanity. They decided to use the airplane itself as the knife. Imagine the focus required. You are flying a 3-ton fighter plane at 300 miles per hour. You are 10 feet off the ground. If you sneeze, you crash. If you twitch, you crash. You have to line up your massive, spinning propeller blade with a thin wire suspended between 2 poles. A propeller is not a pair of scissors. It is a meat grinder. Hitting a steel cable with a spinning prop can shatter the blades, tear the engine off its mounts, and kill you instantly. They did it anyway. The Mustangs roared through the telephone line. The pilots used their wings and their propellers to slice through the copper and steel. They felt the impacts shudder through the airframe. Behind them, the wires whipped and snapped, falling uselessly into the sand. Silence descended on the Egyptian command bunkers. Generals in Cairo were shouting into dead phones. Frontline commanders were screaming for orders that never came. In the confusion, the Israeli paratroopers dropped into the Mitla Pass and the war was effectively decided in the first hour. The Mustang had reinvented itself again. It was no longer a fighter. It was a wire cutter. Israel kept the old warbirds flying until 1961. By then, they were battered, sandblasted, and tired. They were finally sold off or put into storage. But while the military career of the Mustang was fading in the Middle East, a new, louder, and faster chapter was beginning back home in America. Remember the silence after the 1949 crash in Cleveland? That silence lasted for 15 years. The death of Bill Odom and the mother and child in Ohio had terrified the public. Air racing was dead. The Mustangs that had been modified for speed were pushed into dark hangars. They sat there, gathering dust, their engines cold. The pilots who loved them grew older. The world moved on to space, races, and moon landings. But you cannot kill the need for speed. You can only suppress it for a while. In 1964, a man named Bill Stead looked at the Nevada desert and saw potential. Stead was a rancher, a boat racer, and a showman. He knew that the problem with Cleveland wasn't the plains, it was the location. You can't race 400 mph fighters over a suburb. But Reno was empty. Reno was surrounded by mountains and sagebrush. If a plane went down here, only the coyotes would see it. Stead convinced the local casinos that air racing would bring in tourists. He convinced ABC's Wide World of Sports to bring the cameras. He found a dirt strip called Sky Ranch, 5,000 feet above sea level. And then he put out the call. Bring out the Mustangs. It was like uncorking a bottle of lightning. The pilots who had been waiting for a decade suddenly had a reason to live again. They dragged the old fighters out of barns. They polished the aluminum until it looked like mercury. They tuned the Merlin engines, ignoring the wartime safety limits. During the war, a Mustang engine was rated for about 1,400 to 1,700 horsepower. If you pushed it past that, your crew chief would yell at you. The racers at Reno looked at those numbers and laughed. They wanted 2,000 horsepower, then 2,500, then 3,000. They injected anti-detonation fluid. They clipped the wings to reduce drag, making the planes unstable but incredibly fast. They boiled the oil. When the flag dropped at that first Reno air race, the sound was different. It wasn't the low rumble of a bomber escort. It was a high-pitched scream. The Mustangs tore around the pylons, wingtip to wingtip, pulling G-forces that would make a modern jet pilot grunt. A new generation of legends was born. These weren't military heroes. They were hot rodders. Aircraft with names like Strager, Voodoo, Dago Red, and Rare Bear became the new icons. But the danger hadn't left. It had just moved to the desert, racing a P-51 at 500 miles per hour, 50 feet. Off the ground is a game of Russian roulette. The engine is being tortured. The connecting rods are moving so fast they are practically liquid. If an engine blows at that altitude, you don't have time to think. You are usually dead before the plane stops sliding. Yet, they kept coming. Every September, the desert would shake. The Mustang proved that it wasn't just a tool of war. It was a canvas for obsession. These mechanics and pilots were pushing 1940s technology further than the original engineers ever dreamed possible. They were proving that the machine had a soul, and that soul wanted to run. But while the Americans were turning the Mustang into a racing car, something much darker was happening in the jungles of Southeast Asia and the islands of the Pacific. The P-51 was about to become a mercenary, a rebel. A tool for revolutions, CIA black ops, and secret wars that never made the nightly news. In Indonesia, in the Philippines, in the steaming heat of Central America, the Mustang was still lethal. And in 1969, 24 years after World War II ended, the Mustang would find itself in one last, bizarre dogfight. It would face an old rival, the Corsair, the Navy versus the Army Air Force, the radial engine versus the liquid-cooled V-12. The fight that every pilot in the officers' club had argued about over beers was about to happen for real. And this time, they wouldn't be shooting camera guns. They would be shooting 20mm cannons. July 1969. The eyes of the world were fixed on the heavens. 3 American astronauts were strapped into a capsule, hurtling through the void toward the moon. In Vietnam, the air war had become a terrifying contest of supersonic speed, radar-guided missiles, and computerized gun sights. The F-4 Phantom and the MiG-21 were screaming over the jungle at Mach 2, but 4,000 miles away, in the humid heat of Central America, a time warp had opened. A war was breaking out that didn't belong in the atomic age. It was a conflict fought with maps, sweat, and airplanes that should have been in museums. The tensions between El Salvador and Honduras had been simmering for years. It was a dispute over land, borders, and immigration. But history remembers it for the spark that finally lit the fuse, a soccer match. After 3 violent qualifying games for the 1970 World Cup, riots broke out. Diplomatic ties were severed. Tanks rolled toward the border. On the morning of July 14, 1969, the Salvadoran Air Force attacked. If you had stood on the runway that day, you would have sworn it was 1944. The Salvadorans were flying Goodyear-built Corsairs and a handful of P-51 Mustangs. The Mustangs were special. They weren't just dusty leftovers. Some were Cavalier Mustangs civilian conversions that had been bought in the United States, upgraded with luxury interiors for business executives, and then hurriedly refitted with guns and bomb racks for war. Opposing them, the Honduran Air Force flew the legendary F-4U Corsair, the distinct bent-wing fighter of the Pacific Theater. It was the ultimate what-if scenario. The Mustang versus the Corsair. The 2 greatest American fighters of World War II were finally going to kill each other. The war was chaotic. In the opening hours, a Salvadoran C-47 transport plane, a slow-moving bus with wings flew over a Honduran airbase. The crew didn't have bomb sights. They didn't even have bomb racks. They simply rolled 100-pound bombs out of the cargo door by hand, hoping to hit something. They missed. But the dogfights that followed were deadly serious. On July 17, Captain Fernando Soto of the Honduran Air Force took off in his Corsair. His engine was a massive radial piston, loud and reliable. He had 20mm cannons in his wings weapons that packed a devastating punch. Soto was already a hero. Earlier that day, he had shot down a Salvadoran Mustang. Now he was hunting for more. He spotted 2 aircraft in the distance. They were Mustangs, flown by Salvadoran captains Douglas Varela and Leonel Lobo. They were faster than Soto. They were sleeker, in a straight line. They should have been able to outrun him. But a dogfight isn't a race. It's a knife fight in a phone booth. The Mustangs dove on Soto's wingman. It was a classic ambush. The Salvadoran pilots thought they had an easy kill. They were focused on the target in front of them, their fingers hovering over the triggers of their machine guns. They made a fatal mistake. They forgot to check their 6. Soto pulled his heavy Corsair into a tight turn. The G-forces crushed him into his seat, the blood draining from his head. The Corsair groaned under the stress, but it held. He slotted in behind the lead Mustang. He didn't use a computer. He didn't wait for a missile tone. He used his eyes and his instinct. He pulled the trigger. The 20mm cannons shuddered. High explosive shells tore through the thin aluminum skin of the Mustang. There was no armor to stop them. The Mustang's engine, that beautiful, fragile, liquid-cooled Merlin, took a direct hit. The aircraft smoked, stalled, and fell from the sky. Captain Varela didn't make it. Moments later, Soto turned his guns on the second Mustang. The result was the same. In the span of a few violent minutes, Fernando Soto had become the last ace of the piston engine era. He had proven, one final time, that in the low-level brutality of a dogfight, the radial engine's toughness could beat the Mustang's speed. The war lasted only 100 hours. It ended with a ceasefire, leaving thousands dead and a strange footnote in aviation history. When the smoke cleared, the world realized something profound. The era was truly over. The P-51 Mustang had fired its guns in anger for the very last time. It had fought the Nazis, the Japanese, the North Koreans, the Arab armies, and finally, its own brothers in Central America. The warrior was done. Now, The scavenger hunt began. While the Mustangs in El Salvador were being parked and forgotten, a movement was started in the United States. The men who had watched these planes being chopped up in 1945 were now adults. They had jobs, they had money, and they had regret. They realized that if they didn't act fast, there would be nothing left to show their children. Ed Maloney, the teenager who had saved the manuals from the bonfire, was leading the charge. He had kept his promise. He had opened a small museum in California, struggling to pay the rent, displaying the aircraft he had scraped together. But now, he wasn't alone. A new breed of treasure hunter emerged. These weren't looking for gold or sunken pirate ships. They were looking for serial numbers. They traveled to the farthest corners of the earth. They went to the jungles of Indonesia, the deserts of Israel, and the airfields of Uruguay. They found Mustangs rotting in tall grass, serving as chicken coops or slowly sinking into swamps. They bought them. They packed them into shipping containers. They brought them home. But bringing them home was the easy part. Restoring them was a nightmare. You have to understand, you can't just go to an auto parts store and buy a fuel pump for a 1944 fighter plane. The factories were gone. The tooling had been melted down. The people who knew how to build these parts were retiring or dying. So, these enthusiasts had to reinvent the industry. They learned how to form aluminum sheets by hand. They learned the lost art of riveting. They tracked down old mechanics in nursing homes and asked them, "How did you turn the valves on a Merlin engine?" It was dangerous work. A restored warbird is a collection of thousands of moving parts, all trying to kill you. If a bolt shears at 300 miles per hour, the result is catastrophic. But the price of these machines began to climb. In the 1960s, you could buy a flying Mustang for $25,000. By the 1980s, it was $150,000. People started to realize that these weren't just old airplanes. They were the Mona Lisas of the 20th century. They were functional flying art. And among these restored legends, one aircraft would rise above the rest. A plane that would prove that even after 70 years, the Mustang could still break records. It started with passion. It ended with millions. As the decades rolled on, the Mustang ceased to be a weapon of war and transformed into something else entirely, an icon. The market exploded. The aircraft that the government once sold for $1, the planes that teenagers like Ed Maloney had watched being snapped in half like twigs, were now becoming the most valuable historic vehicles on the planet. Today, you cannot buy a P-51 Mustang for the price of a used car. You need the budget of a small corporation. A flyable Mustang now commands between $2 and $4 million. If the plane has a documented combat history, if it actually dropped bombs on German or strafed trains in France, the price can climb north of $5 million. It has become the ultimate status symbol. Tom Cruise owns one. He doesn't just look at it, he flies it. In Top Gun Maverick, that wasn't a prop. That was his personal P-51. Tearing across the screen, reminding a digital generation of what real mechanical fury looks like. But among the millionaires and the movie stars, a different kind of obsession took hold. The obsession with perfection. For years, restoration meant painting the plane shiny and putting a modern radio in the cockpit so you could fly safely to an airshow. But in 2011, a project began in Minnesota that changed the rules. The target was a Mustang named Sierra Sioux 2. This aircraft was a time capsule. It had served in Europe in the final months of World War II. It had been sold to Sweden, then to Nicaragua, then passed through civilian hands in America. But miraculously, it had never been heavily modified. The restoration team at Air Corps Aviation didn't want to make it like new. They wanted to make it exactly as it was. They spent 3 years obsessing over details that 99% of people would never see. They stripped the airframe down to the skeleton. They found that nearly every single component was original to the factory floor in 1944. They didn't replace the wiring with modern cables. They manufactured wires that looked and felt like the 1940s cotton-braided originals. They reinstalled the armor plating behind the pilot's seat. They even put the guns back in. When Sierra Sioux 2 emerged from the shop in 2014, it wasn't a restoration. It was a resurrection. If a pilot from 1944 had climbed into that cockpit, he would have known exactly where every switch, every dial, and every lever was. It was a ghost brought back to life in high definition. But looking at them is one thing. Flying them to the edge of space is another. In May 2013, a pilot named Doug Matthews decided that the Mustang still had something to prove. He wasn't interested in racing low around pylons. He wanted to go up. The service ceiling of a P-51 during the war was theoretically around 41,000 feet. But that was a brand new plane, flown by a desperate kid in 1944. Matthews was flying a 70-year-old antique named the Rebel. He took off from Florida and pointed the nose at the sun. He climbed past the clouds. He climbed past the airliners. The temperature outside the canopy dropped to 60 degrees below zero. The air became so thin that without his pressure suit and oxygen system, his blood would have literally boiled. He kept climbing. At 42,568 feet, the engine was gasping. The wings were clawing for grip in the thin atmosphere. He was flying higher than any piston-engine aircraft had ever sustained in level flight. He was nearly 9 miles high. The old warbird didn't shake. It didn't stall. It hummed. Matthews set a world altitude record that day. He proved that the engineering of the 1940s wasn't just good for its time. It was timeless. The machine built to escort bombers to Berlin could still outclimb the modern world. And what of the man who started it all? Ed Maloney, the kid who stood at the fence in 1945, lived to see his dream realized. He spent his entire life saving what others threw away. By the time he passed away in August 2016, his small collection had grown into the Planes of Fame Air Museum, housing over 150 aircraft, many of them the last surviving examples of their kind. He died on National Aviation Day. It was a fitting exit for the man who refused to let history be melted down. So, what happened to the P-51 Mustang after World War II? It didn't just survive, it evolved. It was the fighter that saved Europe. It was the mud fighter that held the line in Korea. It was the wire cutter that blinded the Egyptian army in the Sinai. It was the mercenary that fought in the jungles of Indonesia. It was the racer that screamed across the Nevada desert. And finally, it became the teacher. Today, there are roughly 160 airworthy Mustangs left in the world. Each time one of them fires up, it is an act of defiance against time. The smoke from the exhaust, the crackle of the Merlin engine, the whistle of the gun portset is a sensory link to a generation that is almost gone. The factories closed 80 years ago. The assembly lines are silent. But look up. If you are lucky, you might catch a flash of silver in the sun. You might hear that distinctive throaty roar that sounds like tearing canvas. It's not a ghost. It's the Mustang, and it is still flying. This is the story of the plane that refused to die. If this journey through history moved you, please take a moment to click the like button. It helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. We are building a library of the forgotten, the brave, and the incredible. And we want you to be a part of it.